Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Friday Ramblings. I'm your host, the Bardic one, and we're going to discuss something that's going to basically be a series over the next couple of months because it's kind of something where this leads to this, which inspires this, and this, and this. So, it's going to take more than one video to discuss this huge topic, and that is censorship. Specifically, organizations that don't so much literally censor, but regulate content. This sounds familiar to a lot of you. After all, we have ratings boards for video games, television, movies that use highly similar systems. And we're going to discuss all these symptoms in further episodes, but we're going to start with the predecessor to all of those, and that is a set of bylaws known as the Hays Code. The Hays Code is really where it all started. But before we can discuss that, we have to discuss why the Hays Code came about. And this goes to the earliest era of filmmaking, the 1900s, all the way back, the first couple decades of the 1900s. And even, as this was something that happened to exist. So, what was Hollywood doing? Well, they were doing pretty much everything. You have to remember, this was a time before the MPAA. Or just MPA. I think they dropped the second A, but most of us grew up, my age grew up as the MPAA, Motion Picture Association of America. Now they're just the Motion Picture Association because, international distribution is the rise of streaming entertainment. You grow and evolve. We'll touch on them again in a few of these episodes. But still, before Hollywood was working side by side with the ASPCA, so you can have those, awesome reassurances at the end of films that, hey, there was careful monitoring done with all animal actors, no animals were harmed in the filming of this motion picture. Before all that, before the idea that movies designed to titillate and inspire lustful thoughts were, by and large, shoehorned into their own little subgenre, sub-industry, known as adult cinema, and a few other things, but we're just going to call them adult cinema for now. We're being polite. We're not focusing on that. Everything was up for grabs. You can make your movies as violent as you wanted. You can make your movies full of what we now would call sexual exploitation. You could have blatantly racist content on there. And I mean, even what in these decades was considered, pretty hateful, negative stereotype reinforcing. Just, bro, that guy's really not cool for thinking and saying those things type content. Because there was no major regulations. The idea was simply, if you go way too far over the board, nobody's going to buy your movie, you're going to go out of business. Wah, boo-hoo. You might have a few local cities, county ordinances, maybe statewide. Decency laws that would prevent your film from being shown in those states. but there wasn't much. Unfortunately, the 1920s came around, in which a series of scandals, most infamous being the murder of William Desmond Taylor, an Anglo-Irish American film director and actor, and the alleged rape of Virginia Rapp by popular movie star Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. These two highly publicized incidents, and the Arbuckle thing's definitely, that's its own hill of beans. I may go into that in another episode, because we do occasionally like dip into legal stuff, but whew, that's a full hill of beans one. But yes, these were major scandals that got widely reported about in the media, and the average person was following. This caused major focus on Hollywood, and the fact that a lot of religious and conservative organizations felt that this was a further sign of what they had long been suspecting, that Hollywood was always inherently corrupt and immoral. And corrupt and immoral is kind of what they go against. This meant that political pressure was put on them, because there was a lot of people in these groups and these were groups that voted and voted heavily, so politicians wanted to keep their votes. Thus, legislators in 37 states began introducing hundreds of film censorship bills in the early 20s. Thus, faced with the prospect of having to comply with hundreds and potentially, over time, thousands of inconsistent, easily changed decency laws in order to show their films and thus stay in business, the handful of major studios got together and chose self-regulation as the preferable option, enlisting Presbyterian elder Will H. Hayes, Postmaster General under former President Warren G. Harding and former head of the Republican National Committee, to rehabilitate Hollywood's image. Again, this is a guy who had already worked major office in politics under a president that was generally considered to not be a highly controversial, scandalous figure. Thus, people were appeased. Like, oh, okay, they're going to have an outsider regulate this. An outsider that's a good person, that understands values. I mean, come on, he's a Presbyterian elder. He's religious. Everybody's happy with this appointment. Everybody calms down. But more importantly is the move itself was somewhat inspired by Major League Baseball's hiring of Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis as lead commissioner in that previous year, after the 1919 World Series gambling scandal put a lot of bad PR on Major League Baseball. New York Times even referring to Will Hayes as the Screen Landis. Hayes was paid the large sum of $100,000 a year, and that's $100,000 back then. These days, that would be the equivalent to almost $2 million a year. Eventually serving for 25 years as president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, what we now call the MPA, as opposed to the MPPDA, where he defended the industry from attacks and negotiated treaties to cease hostilities. A couple years into his term, Hayes introduced a set of recommendations dubbed the Formula, which the studios were advised to heed, and asked filmmakers to describe to his office the plots of films they were planning on producing, so he could make sure that anything that did not need to be shown to the public would be nipped in the bud. Now, it's important to remember in this context that previously in 1915, the Supreme Court had decided unanimously that free speech did not extend to motion pictures, and that there had been token attempts to clean up Hollywood films before. This would be the first major movement. Eventually, in 1927, Hayes suggested to studio executives that they form a committee to discuss film censorship, eventually collaborating on a list called the Don'ts and Be Carefuls, based on items that were challenged by local censor boards. The list was approved by the FTC, and Hayes created the Studio Relations Committee to oversee its implementation. Unfortunately, the nature of Hayes' job, he did not actually have the power to legally enforce the tenets. These were recommended guidelines at this point. The major points of the original Don'ts and Be Carefuls as proposed in 1927 was pointed profanity. This includes things like using God, Lord, Jesus, and Christ in profane terms. It was okay to use them in a reverential tone, as they should be used, but not to use them as expletives. Along with hell, SOB, and classic profane terms that already existed, any licentious or suggestive nudity, in fact or in silhouette, the illegal traffic in drugs, any inference, gotta make sure I say that right, there's a lot of similar words to that, of sex perversion, white slavery, miscegenation, aka the sexual relations or marriage between people who are considered to be members of different races, what we would now call interracial sexual relationships. Again, it's the 1920s, different standards, people. This is simply what was, being addressed. Sex hygiene and venereal diseases, scenes of actual childbirth in fact or in silhouette, children's sex organs, ridicule of the clergy, and willful offense to any nation, race, or creed. Now, these are the flat-out don'ts. The be highly careful with included things such as the use of the flag, international relations, arson, use of firearms, successful thievery and robbery, especially safecracking, dynamiting of trains, mines, and buildings, brutality and possible gruesomeness, technique of committing murder by whatever method. Basically, don't have your fictional movies give highly detailed instructions on how to get away with murder. Be a little more vague on how it happens, folks. Methods of smuggling, torture, actual hangings or electrocutions as legal punishment for crime, sympathy for criminals, sedition, cruelty to children and animals, branding of people and animals, the sale of women or women selling her virtue, aka prostitution, rape or attempted rape, men and women in bed together, deliberate seduction of underage girls, the institution of marriage, again, portray it only in positive lights, folks, surgical operations, the use of drugs, negative portrayal of law enforcement officers, and excessive or lustful kissing, aka serious making out. Ultimately, it was not until 1934 when an amendment to the code was adopted, which established the Production Code Administration, that things got going. This meant the Production Code Administration required that all films released after July 1st, 1934 to obtain a certificate of approval before being released. Now we're getting into what sounds like modern day stuff, aren't we? The PCA had two offices, one in Hollywood and the other in New York City. The first film to receive an MPPDA seal of approval was The World Moves On. For over 30 years, virtually all motion pictures produced in the United States adhered to the code. The production code was not created or enforced by federal, state, or city government. Again, the Hollywood studios adopted the code in large part in the hopes of avoiding government self-censorship, preferring self-regulation to government regulation. This is often referred to as the Breen era, as Joseph Breen, a prominent Catholic layman who had worked in public relations, was appointed head of the PCA. up until his retirement in 1954, and he enforced the production code highly rigidly, to the point that even cartoon sex symbol Betty Boop had to change her characteristic flapper personality and dress, adopting an old-fashioned near-matronly appearance. Fortunately, though, during this era, that prohibition against miscegenation, aka interracial relationships, was much more narrowly focused, and it said the only thing that was actually prohibited was showing sexual relation between different races. So you can say people are romantically attracted, you just can't show them or implying that they are doing such things. See, we're moving forward. We gave it a decade. We're allowed to say that they can date. We're just not allowed to say there's anything physical being done on that. We're making little progress here, folks. That's the point. Making progress, moving forward. Remember, it's the nature of the times. We are not judging by today's standards. First major instance of censorship under this production code involved the 1934 film Tarzan and His Mate, in which brief nude scenes involving a body double for actress Maureen O'Sullivan were edited out of the master negative of the film. This use of the code and its rigid enforcement led studios to remake some of its early 1930s era films, as well as a few from the 20s, so that essentially they could be released. As when it was all said and done, so much editing would have had to be done to the old films, it was more efficient just to remake them. The Hays Code also required changes regarding adaptation of other media. For instance, in the case of Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, it could not retain a major element from the Daphne du Maurier 38 novel in which it was based on, due to it having a character get away with murder and living happily ever after. Hitchcock's version had the murderer die in an accident. Yes, I'm being very vague because I do not want to give spoilers. There's nothing wrong with watching classic films. Most importantly, because this film was actually remade in 2020 over in Britain, and not being bound by the code anymore restored the original plot element. So, haha. Woohoo. We got a film adaptation that was story accurate. Just had to wait 90 years. PCA would also engage in political censorship. Specifically, the clauses about portrayal of the flags and being wary of creating overtly negative depictions of other countries and their governments. This meant that Breen ultimately had the power to change scripts and scenes, which angered many writers, directors, and Hollywood moguls. However, on a positive note, Breen's influence meant that the production of Casablanca meant that explicit references to Rick and Ilsa having slept together in Paris, and the film mentioning that Captain Renault extorted sexual favors from his supplicants were removed, and while they were strongly implied in the finished version, these, along with the code ruling out any possibility of the film ending with Rick and Ilsa consummating their adulterous love, means that led to the ending of Casablanca, which is often cited as one of the most famous endings and most beloved endings in Hollywood history. Many of the directors that started up post-code and its rigid enforcement would actually praise aspects of the code, claiming that its principles forced them to be more creative in scripting and shooting, making them think about how to get the message across in a way that was more artistic and subtle instead of just slamming it in people's faces when they watch the movie. Multiple directors claiming that these versions turned out much better than if they had simply made the films and straight up showed this content. Now, newsreels, it should be noted, were exempt from the code due to the fact that it was not entertainment but information. Although certain content was toned down due to the overtly violent nature of it. Hey, this happens even in today's news. Ultimately, the most famous defiance of the code at its peak was The Outlaw, a Western produced by Howard Hughes, which was denied a certificate of approval after it was completed in 1941, since the film's advertising focused particular attention on actress Jane Russell's breasts. When the film's initial 1943 release was shuttered by the MPPDA after a week, Hughes eventually persuaded Breen that this did not violate the code and the film could be shown, although without a seal of approval. The film got its eventual general release in 1946. The Selznick production Duel in the Sun was also released in 1946 without the approval of the Hays office, featuring several on-screen deaths, miscegenation, adultery, and displays of lust. The financial success of both films led to the weakening code in the late 40s, this ultimately leading to some people trying to make the code much more rigid. However, studio heads, including Louis B. Mayer of MGM, being outed after a series of disputes with fellow production head Dory Sherry due to the desire to make gritty social realism films being at odds with the Hays office. In 1954, Bren retired, and Jeffrey Sherlock was appointed as his successor. Ultimately, while Hollywood would continue to work within the confines of the production code through the 40s and 50s, the rise of television would create a new rival and the encouragement from different studios to have more creative freedom than the code allowed, to compete with people who felt it would be better just stay home and watch TV. There was also increasing competition from foreign films that were not bound by the code that were starting to be released in America, such as Bicycle Thieves, The Ways of Love, which itself was part of the L'Amour anthology film, thus creating some more disputes over the interpretation of the First Amendment's freedom of speech when it applies to film. Especially the overruling of the 1915 decision, which meant that, lo and behold, with there no longer being a precedent that and in fact quite the opposite being true, that film was now protected by freedom of speech, the threat of government regulation was greatly reduced, and thus the major justification for the Hays Code and its successors meant that the code's power over the Hollywood industry was greatly reduced. Thus, in 1963, upon the death of MPAA President Eric Johnston, after a 3-year period of erratic application of the codes, Jack Valenti, who was seen as leading a liberal faction in Hollywood, became the association's new head. And Valenti, an opponent of the production code, began work on a new rating system under which film restrictions would lessen by instituting a series of essentially grades that would inform people of the content of the film so they could make informed decisions, and thus, hey, it's not our fault you watched this movie. We told you this kind of stuff would be in it. Sorry. This led to 1966 and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, the first film to feature the Suggested for Mature Audiences label. Although, ultimately, there was still some issue of censoring the script. It was the first one released with a new ranking system. Now, this led to 2 years later when the MPAA film rating system officially went into effect. We will give this its own video discussion in part 2 of this series. But it should note that 68 was the point at which the Hays Code was, for all intents and purposes, dead. Ultimately, the biggest loss of the Hays office and its production code was that the American Humane Association, which depended on the Hays Code and its office for the right to monitor sets, led to, over the next 14 years, an increase in animal cruelty on movie sets. Ultimately, in 1980, the modern MPAA would give the Humane Association, and as I said, these days, its related buddy, the ASPCA, depending on, which group wants to do the monitoring. It's usually the Humane Association, but as I said, I don't like to make huge blanket statements. But the point is they regained their rights to monitor sets in 1980. So yes, there was unfortunately a 15 year period of transition where animal cruelty did happen, but it's been good since 1980. And as I said, this leads us up to the MPAA era, which is what we are still living in. So, was it all worth it? Yes. As we said, the fact is, without any sort of government regulation code, Hollywood was getting out of control. The only thing limiting what was put in films was, if we make it too much of certain elements, folks won't go see it and we won't make money. And while certainly free market economy is important, there comes a point where it's like, dude, I get you think in some parts of the country folks are going to be cool with this and it'll be right to make this. There were points where certain directors were just plain doing stuff in bad taste. And with the subsequent, more importantly, regulation of the film content, and thus leading to the ousting of people that were just plain shock tactic edgelords, as we would call them in later decades, you got people that were more respectful and artistically minded coming into Hollywood, which led to better treatment of the actors and actresses, even amongst each other, because, as we said, part of this was real-world behind-the-scenes scandals. And it's like, nope, look, no. This has got to end. It's like, y'all are not, just folks that can go around and do anything you want. This is not the Wild West. Our industry is regulated, which means you got to regulate your own behavior if you want to be in this industry. This, along with, as I said, the decades-long, except for that awkward 15-year period there in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, of discouraging of animal cruelty on set. That's always a good thing. Hey, films got better under the Hays Code. When people talk about iconic classic films, they refer to stuff in the 30s and 40s and 50s when this kind of self-regulation was at its peak. Yes, people will talk about the silent films and those films from the early 20s, but usually, I mean, in a historical footnote. They're great. I mean, some of them are the best of those films are great films, but filmmaking was not hurt by self-regulation. As we said, though, over time, the rigidity of the code and its nature did lead to the successor of the MPAA ranking system. And we're going to discuss that next month. For now, I've held you long enough, so go. Go watch some films. Enjoy the movies. Watch some from the Hays Code era. It was a good thing. And with that, I'll see you in 7. In the meantime and in between time, make sure you subscribe, drop your comments, and more importantly, feel free to drop suggestions. Because, hey, if we can talk about it in a way that's entertaining and constructive, we'll be happy to do so. See you next time, folks.